Hi, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to add one last thing to our second enemy design. If we go over to our event sheet, under the Enemy 2 group, we have a section for Enemy 2 movement events, and we have it moving in a specific pattern. And then we have Enemy 2 attack, so when our main character gets too close to the enemy, it triggers an attack. The last thing we're going to add is a way for our player to attack and defeat the enemy. Now, we've done this before for Enemy 1. If you want to try doing it on your own, I think that's great. It's the same process, but I'll show you how to do it again for Enemy 2. The only thing that might be a little bit different is on Enemy 1, we added knockback so that when the player hits the enemy gets shoved back a little bit. I think we're going to leave this off on this enemy. You can add it if you want. The only reason why I'm leaving it off is because since this enemy moves in a specific pattern, if you hit it with knockback, it might move that pattern a little bit, which might not be a big deal, but I don't think we need it. So we're going to add a couple things to start with. We want to add an instance variable that controls how much life our enemy has. We're also going to add a behavior called flash so that when the enemy gets hit, it'll flash for a second to communicate to the player that the enemy's been hit. So let's go ahead and add that first. We want to make sure that our enemy is clicked on. We're going to go over to the left side panel. I'm going to click first on instance variables. I'm going to add a new instance variable. I'm going to call it health. You could call it HP, hit points, life, whatever kind of terminology you want to use. The type is going to be number, and the initial value is how many hit points you want your enemy to have. How many times the player has to hit the enemy before it'll be destroyed. I recommend starting with a relatively small number. I'm going to start with 3. We can always change that later. Great. Now, the other thing I want to add is another behavior. If I click on behaviors, I have an H direction, a timer, a line of sight. Let's add a new one, flash. Okay, now let's take it over to our event sheet. I'm going to add a new event. I'm going to go to my Enemy 2. And I want to scroll down to where you'll find on collision with another object. Click on that. And we're going to choose which object we want to have damage our enemy. Now you have some options here. We have a projectile, right? Mine's called arrow. We also have an attack hitbox that we've created for our characters like melee attacks. We can use either one here. We can also use both. We could add this for both types of attack. Let's just choose one for now. I'm going to start with the projectile. And click done. So now what this event says is when Enemy 2 and the arrow projectile collide with each other, we can make an action happen. That action is going to be for Enemy 2. And what I want to do is subtract 1 from the instance variable health. So I'm going to scroll down to subtract from. Double click on that. It should be set to health. And the value is how much you want to take away from that life total. Now that's handy because say you have different types of attack that might do different types of damage or different amounts of damage. So maybe the projectile only does 1 damage, but maybe like the physical attack, the melee attack does like 10 damage, right? You can control that by changing this value. I'm going to leave it at 1 for now. So when the enemy and the arrow collide, subtracts 1 from the health. Now, the next thing I want to do is add another event. I'm going to go to Enemy 2. And I'm going to scroll down to where it says compare instance variables. What I can do here is say that when health is equal or less than 0, then I can make the enemy be destroyed. Now, the reason why I'm doing less or equal is because it's possible to have less than 0 health. Say, for example, your Enemy 2 has 1 hit point left, and you do an attack that does 5 damage to it. Its life wouldn't just stop at 0. It would actually dip down into -4. So if you have just equal to 0, if you accidentally go negative with the enemy's life, it won't be destroyed. So it makes sense to go less or equal. So if it goes even below 0, we can still have the enemy be defeated. So health less or equal to 0. I'm going to add an action, and when the Enemy 2's life is 0 or less, I'm going to destroy it. Now this should work. Let's test it out. It's not going to look very good, but let's see if it works. So here comes my enemy. I hit it. Oh. If I can hit it. There's 1, 2, and perhaps 3. So it gets destroyed, but it's a little bit hard to tell what's going on, right? I can't tell exactly when I'm hitting my enemy. And the reason why is because the game doesn't give me any kind of visual communication. There's no like feedback for the player on when they've hit it. So what I want to do is a couple things. I'm going to make it so that when I've hit my enemy, the enemy starts flashing. I also might want to make it so that when the arrow hits the arrow stops, right? It shouldn't just keep going through the enemy. So let's add both of those things. First, let's make our projectile disappear. Let's make it stop when it hits the enemy. Now, if you're not doing a projectile, if you're doing like a physical attack, you don't have to worry about this. But I'm going to add an action for this event. When the enemy and the projectile, the arrow collide, I'm going to go to my arrow. I'm going to say destroy. Now that alone will help a lot because I can tell if I hit the worm because my arrow should stop. And if I miss, my arrow will keep going. Good. The other thing I want to do is I want to make it so that my enemy will flash for just maybe a second after it gets hit. And to do that, I'm going to add another action for this event. Go to enemy 2, scroll down to flash, and under the flash behavior, we have how long it'll stay on, how long it'll stay off, and then how long it'll flash for. By default, these settings are pretty good. 1 second I think makes sense, so let's do that. I hit it. I made this game too hard. Okay, and then it flashes for a second. Perfect. Now, it makes sense to have the enemy be invincible for a brief second after it gets hit. And the reason why is because, say for example, you have a weapon that does multiple hitboxes. You don't want all those hitboxes to count. You just want the enemy to be hit once by an attack and then to be invulnerable for a brief second. So let's add that. To do that, we need to add another instance variable. I'm going to go back to my layout and I'm going to click once on my enemy to make sure he's selected. I'm going to go back up to instance variables. I'm going to add a new one. I'm going to call this one invincible. You can name it something else, but it's something that's going to represent that the enemy can't take damage while invincible is true. And the type, instead of being a number this time, it's going to be a Boolean, a true-false statement. Good. Click OK. And close that. And let's go back to our event sheet. We're going to say that when it gets hit by the arrow, I'll turn invincible to true. So add action, go to enemy 2, set Boolean for invincible to true. Then I want to wait a second and turn invincible back to false. Now, if we want to wait a second, we have to add an action. We go to our system, and at the very bottom of system, there's wait. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to say, wait just 1 second. And then after it waits for a second, I can add another action, go to enemy 2, set the Boolean for invincible to false. So it's true, waits 1 second, turns false. Now, the last thing we have to do to make this work is we're going to say that this can only happen when invincible is false. If invincible is true, we want to skip all the subtracting from health and all that stuff. So I'm going to add one more condition over here on the left. I can double click on the left tab, go to enemy 2, and I'm going to go down to is Boolean instance variable set. Double click on that, and we're going to go to invincible. Now, by default, this is true, right? It's going to say that when enemy 2 is invincible and it gets hit by an arrow, then subtract 1 from health, which is actually the opposite of what we want. We want this to only happen if enemy 2 is not invincible, if invincible is false. So we can reverse this by right-clicking on it and hitting invert. So now our condition is when it gets hit by an arrow and invincible is false, then it'll subtract 1 from health, it'll start flashing, it'll turn invincible for a second so it can't take any more damage, and then it'll go back to being vulnerable again. Great, let's try it out. Hit it once, hit it twice, and it's destroyed. Now, the last thing I want to add is the animation when we destroy our enemy. Now, this is something we already added for enemy 1. If you remember, we created an object called enemy defeat. You might have named it something different, but it's just an animation, kind of a generic animation that we can use for whenever any of our enemies are defeated. What we're going to do is we're going to trigger it so that as our enemy 2 is defeated, it spawns that animation. Let's go back over to our event sheet. We're going to add one last event, one last action for this event, actually. The enemy 2 health is equal or less than 0. We're going to add an action for enemy 2. We're going to tell enemy 2 to spawn another object. And the object is going to be our defeat. I'm going to click done. Now, technically, this won't actually work because we're telling Construct to destroy enemy 2 before we're telling it to spawn the defeat on enemy 2. Enemy 2 is already destroyed. It won't work. So we have to rearrange the order here by dragging spawn up above destroy. Enemy 2 will spawn the enemy defeat animation first and then destroy itself. And if all that's set up correctly, we should be able to hit our enemy 3 times and then the animation plays. Perfect. And that should do it for our second enemy type. We might come back and add some stuff down the road, but I think that what we have here is good. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is just do some organization. I'm going to add a subgroup to enemy 2 by right-clicking and hitting add subgroup. I'm going to call this enemy 2 life. And I'm going to move the 2 events that I've created here into that subgroup. And that way, everything's organized in the enemy 2 group. And I'm ready to move on to enemy 3. Great. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.